Welcome to Melbourne Conversations, the City of Melbourne's free program of free talks. We love that. It's lovely to have you here. The question we're asking tonight is, do healthy parks equal healthy people? And I imagine that's sort of a rhetorical question in some sense. My name is Natasha Mitchell. I'm from ABC Radio National. I host our national weekly program called All in the Mind. It's a delight to be here tonight. And tonight is very much about land and how we relate to it, what it gives us. And so I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered here in central Melbourne on the traditional land of the Kulin Nation, whose elders, past and present, hold this place in their hearts and their history and their culture, and we respect them for that. Richard Louvp is a journalist and acclaimed for his book, The Last Child in the Woods, saving our children from what he calls nature deficit disorder. He's chairman and co-founder of the Children and Nature Network, which sort of was born out of this book, and it's really galvanised what seems to be a growing international movement around this observed disconnection between children and nature. And I shared a conversation with him today about a very special place that seems to have inspired what many decades of work since, and that was a tree house that he built at about age 9 or 10. And this wasn't some average tree house. This was a 4-storey tree house that he built himself, no parent involved. It was probably slightly precarious, possibly litigious, but it was a tree house that has inspired him for many years since. And let's give him a warm welcome to Melbourne.
Actually, I didn't build all of it. I recruited the neighborhood kids and got them to do the heavy lifting. We built it out of stolen lumber, too. In so many ways, we are a lonely species. And much of what we're talking about here is our need to have neighbors. To think about social capital, for instance, in a very different way. Robert Putnam, the Harvard professor, as many of you know, wrote a book a few years ago called Bowling Alone, and he talked about the disappearance of associations in the United States. Bowling leagues were one of them that he gave as an example. And social capital is basically defined as how, when we connect with each other, how that creates community, and that should be a measurable thing that makes life better. I think that we really ought to start talking about social nature capital, that we are not alone on this earth. You know, the animals that live in my neighborhood, that come into my backyard, they improve my social life. I have a social life with them. So we need to begin to see ourselves as not alone. There's a researcher here in Australia, Glenn Albrecht in Perth, who talks about solastalgia, which is the fear of loss of nature. He describes it as a kind of deep homesickness for the nature that we are missing in our lives. David Sobel at Antioch in the United States talks about ecophobia. He defines that as the kind of fear that we're really in many ways burdening our young children with, the fear of environmental disaster. We need to talk about global warming. We need to address these major issues. But too soon, before children ever even have a chance to have an experience in nature just for the joy of it, we start telling them about the end of nature. We need to be very careful about how we talk to our children about the future. We need to see that this era that we are entering, because of climate change and all these environmental issues that we do face, could be, should be, one of the most creative periods in human history. This is a great opportunity. Let me read just a few paragraphs from the beginning of Last Child in the Woods. If, when we were young, we tramped through forests of Nebraska cottonwoods, or raised pigeons on a rooftop in Queens, or fished for Ozark bluegills, or felt the swell of a wave that traveled 1,000 miles before lifting our boat, we were bound to the natural world and remain so today. Nature still informs our years, lifts us, carries us. For children, nature comes in many forms: a newborn calf, a pet that lives and dies, a worn path through the woods, a fort nested in stinging nettles, a damp, mysterious edge of a vacant lot. Whatever shape nature takes, it offers each child an older, larger world separate from parents. Unlike television, nature does not steal time, it amplifies it. Nature offers healing for a child living in a destructive family or neighborhood. It serves as a blank slate upon which a child draws and reinterprets the culture's fantasies. Nature inspires creativity in a child by demanding visualization and the full use of the senses. Given a chance, a child will bring the confusion of the world to the woods, wash it in the creek, turn it over to see what lives on the unseen side of that confusion. Nature can frighten a child too, and this fright serves a purpose. In nature, a child finds freedom, fantasy, and privacy, a place distant from the adult world, a separate piece. These are some of the utilitarian values of nature. But at a deeper level, nature gives itself to children for its own sake, not as a reflection of a culture. At this level, inexplicable nature provokes humility. Many of you are here tonight because you had a special place in nature when you were a child. And that place is probably still in your heart. And if you're like me, sometimes you go to that place in your heart. Even if the bulldozers finally came and took it away, in reality, it remains in your heart. And if you're like me, you find something there that you don't find anywhere else. You find a certain humility, and you find a certain strength. It seems to me that the question that is before us in terms of the disconnection of this generation of children from nature, and possibly future generations, is, will they have that place to go to in their heart when they become adults? My special place was not only that treehouse. My special place was in the behind our house. I grew up in Kansas City at the edge of the suburbs, and I could go through my yard, through the hedge, into the cornfield where my underground fort was. I was pretty busy. And then on into the woods and the fields and the farms that seemed to go on forever. I spent much of my boyhood in those woods with my dog. A lot of it alone, but not alone. I had such a sense of ownership. Those were my woods. I'm sure your special places, you own those places. Those were my woods. To the extent that I pulled out, I think, as an 8-year-old, hundreds of survey stakes that I knew had something to do with the bulldozers that were taking out other woods. I told that story a couple years ago in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to a group called the Quivira Coalition that is bringing together environmentalists and ranchers in the West to do land trusts and other methods to preserve nature. After the speech, a man stood up. Half of this audience, by the way, I was speaking to was actually wearing cowboy hats. And he stood up, and he was the real deal. His jeans had not been acid washed. He had thick plastic glasses on. He was sunburned. He had a white handlebar mustache. He was a rancher. And he said, "You know that story you told about pulling out stakes?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I did that when I was a boy." And then he began to cry in front of 500 people, half of whom were wearing cowboy hats. And despite his deep embarrassment, he continued to speak about his sense of loss, of grief, at the thought that his might be one of the last generations to have that kind of sense of ownership of land, and it has nothing to do with money. I could read you all the statistics, and I won't, that show that this widening gap between children is here. It's in the United States, it's in the UK, it's even in some of the developing countries. The whole world is urbanizing. Over half of us on this earth now live in cities. That's going to continue. Urbanization itself is not a bad thing. Urbanization without nature is soul-destroying. So we have to figure out a different way to live, where we live. The benefits of nature, Marty talked about some of those. One of the things we have to do is tell other people about those benefits. Only recently, in the last decade or so, have the people who study child development begun to, in any kind of intense way, study the impact of the natural world on child development. We've studied what everything else affects, how everything else affects children, but we haven't looked at the natural world until quite recently. And Marty is one of the people who's pulling that information together now so we can begin to understand it as a whole. But just some examples. In University of Illinois, researchers there have looked at the impact of the natural world, just a walk in the woods, a walk through the trees, on children with the symptoms of attention deficit disorder, and see a remarkable impact of just that little experience for kids as young as 5 years old. They recommend that nature therapy be added to the other two traditional therapies for attention deficit disorder, which are behavioral modification and Ritalin and other stimulants. As a journalist, I can ask the provocative question that perhaps an academic stands back from. I agree with them that nature therapy ought to be added, and certainly Natural England, there are things happening here that nature therapy is beginning to find its way. But the question I would ask is, could it be that at least some, not all, but at least some of the huge increase in the number of kids that are being given Ritalin and other stimulants to control their behavior? In some schools in the United States, 30% of the boys are on Ritalin. Could it be that at least some of that might have something to do with the fact that we took nature away from kids in the first place? Could it be that at least some of the huge increase in the number of young children, even little children, being given antidepressants might have something to do with the fact that we took nature away from them in the first place? Could it be the fact that we no longer talk about adult onset diabetes because it starts earlier now, and children are now on adult drugs, what used to be adult drugs for diabetes? Might that have something to do with the fact that we took natural play away from kids? You know, the greatest increase in child obesity in our history occurred during the same 2 decades as the greatest increase in organized sports for children in our history. Not against soccer, not in this city in particular, not against football, but it's not doing it. It's not doing it. That kind of activity that many of us remember, where we were just moving all the time. You got home, you threw your books on the couch, and you were out the door. Nothing can replace that in terms of its impact on health, on obesity, etc. Children learn better. Studies of natural play spaces compared to flat asphalt or cement play spaces. The kids in the natural play spaces are far more likely to invent their own games. The kids who emerge as leaders in these two places are different. The kids who emerge on the flat asphalt or turf playgrounds tend to be the physically strongest. That's a good thing, to be physically strong. The kids who emerge as leaders in the natural play space tend to be the smartest, which makes sense because they're inventing their own games. One of the reasons that this gap is happening is because parents are so intent on enriching their children's lives. I certainly was, and this is a good thing. But we are rushing them from Suzuki violin lessons in some of our neighborhoods to soccer, football, etc., to organized things where parents are in charge, not the child. There was a study done recently that it replicated a study that was done in the 1940s of what's called executive function. Executive function is that voice inside your head that says, maybe it's not a good idea to follow your buddies off the cliff. It's all about self-control. The best way for young children to develop executive function is through independent make-believe play. Which makes sense because when you are making up your own world, you're the executive of it. I was the executive of that treehouse. What they found is that 7-year-olds today have the executive function of 5-year-olds in the 1940s. In other words, we sliced away 2 years of development in terms of executive function at their most vulnerable ages. Natural play in natural areas, is far more likely to create the kind of independent, make-believe play that is so important for that development of creative, self-controlling, executive children. One of the things that's happened recently in the United States is Michelle Obama has started a program on obesity. It's a great thing that she's done that. In fact, her speechwriter called me a couple days before she announced it to check a fact in Last Child in the Woods. But I was disappointed when it was announced. There were 2 things missing. One was independent play, and the other one was nature. I think they're going to show up there sooner or later. In any case, these benefits of learning in nature, for instance, one study in California looked at 3 school districts that still had some kind of immersion program in nature, like a 6th grade camp. And they found that the kids in those, in that setting, the so-called at-risk kids, did 26% better on science testing than the kids in the typical classroom. Again and again, you see it. Now, many of these studies are correlative, not causal. We need a lot more research, as Howard Frumpkin, who is the head of the Environmental Center at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, who's one of the speakers here at this conference, says, yes, we need more research on this issue, but we know enough to act. That's part of the good news. The good news is that we have this emerging body of evidence that Marty's done such a great job of pulling together. We can use that evidence. The second part of the good news is that in the last few years, there really has been a kind of movement that has emerged. Last Child in the Woods is a useful tool in that movement. It's not the cause of it. The kind of perfect storm has occurred in which we've begun, many of us, to look around at what's happening to our children. And the phrase nature deficit disorder, which, I was a little embarrassed. My publisher made me put it on the cover. It was an idea in the book, but I didn't want to do it, which shows you what I know about marketing. But that phrase caught on. People know exactly what it is. They've seen it. We didn't really have a language to talk about this thing that was happening. The minute they hear nature deficit disorder, they've seen it. They know they've seen it. They may have it. I have it. But a movement has emerged. In the United States, there are in North America, there are over 71 regional campaigns, sometimes state campaigns, sometimes whole provinces in Canada. There are at least 15 governors that have signed on to this. Parks have been reopened because of this. In Illinois, 7 parks were reopened because the new governor became very concerned about the disconnect between children and nature, and also because he saw the economic benefits of having nearby nature during a harsh recession. People need a place to go to. There are family nature clubs starting to emerge. This idea was suggested a couple years ago to me in an email from a father and second grade teacher. He and his wife had read Last Child and read other things, and they got inspired, and they started taking their kids to parks on weekends to take a hike. Sometimes they actually did stream reclamation. And one day the 5-year-old tugs on his father's pants and says, "Dad, how come we're the only family having this much fun?" And so the father started reaching out to other families. And before long, he had a long email list of other families. He has now over 400 families as part of his family nature club. And what these families do is that they call each other up. They connect on the internet, and they arrange what essentially is a family nature play date at the park on Saturday morning. 4 or 5 families, 2 families will show up at the park. What this does is several things. First off, it deals with the intense, the deep fear that parents feel of strangers, which is the number one reason this disconnect is occurring. It's not, I don't believe it's all electronics. This fear that parents feel, which has been created, much of it, by my profession, by the news media and the entertainment media. All you have to do is watch CNN or Fox, and you'll see how they take a handful of terrible crimes against children and they repeat them over and over and over again. That's the very definition of conditioning. In truth, in the United States at least, the number of child abductions by strangers has been going down for about 3 decades. But we feel this great fear. These family nature clubs, there's perceived safety in numbers. Several families show up together. Any kind of family can do this. Doesn't matter the economic background. Any kind of neighborhood can do it. Think how great this would be for single-parent families who face all kinds of logistics. And one of the greatest things is you don't have to wait for funding. You can do it yourself, and you can do it now. Those are spreading in the United States. I hope they begin to spread, and they may already be spreading by another name in Australia. What if that caught on, like book clubs did in recent decades? And what if, 2 years from now, there were 5,000 of those in Australia, or 10,000 in the United States? At that point, we'd be talking about real cultural change that goes beyond the programmatic. Not just depending on programs to connect kids to nature, but people in their own cultures beginning to do that for themselves because they value it. That movement is growing. I know in Western Australia they're talking about creating, and I'm going to go to Perth in a few days, they're talking about a Western Australia Children in Nature network. Again, these are ordinary people, many of them. This issue, unlike any issue I've ever seen, brings people together across religious and political barriers. It doesn't seem to matter what somebody's politics or religion is. They almost always want to tell me about the treehouse when they were kids, that they built when they were kids, or something else, their special place in nature. I gave congressional testimony a couple years ago, and there are 6 congressmen that showed up to this subcommittee. I'm told that's a big turnout. And there were 3 of us that gave testimony. One was Nature Conservancy, one was about endangered species, and there was me. At the end of it, all these congressmen wanted to do is talk about their special place in nature when they were kids, and you couldn't shut them up. In those moments, there were no Democrats in the room, and there were no Republicans in the room. There were just 6 men who had a shared memory. And like that rancher in New Mexico, they didn't want to be in the last generation to have it. I've seen developers, the people I pulled out all those stakes trying to prevent. I've seen developers come to the table and begin to think differently. Clint Eastwood organized a small conference of the biggest developers in California, asked me to come and give my sermonette. And then we spent a day in workshops, and these developers were beginning to think, how can we build developments in the future that actually connect kids and adults to nature? How can we do that not only in the suburbs or at the edge and cause more sprawl? How can we do that when we redevelop urban neighborhoods? How can we do that when we redevelop some of the decaying circles of suburbs? How can we create essentially a new civilization? I will end here, and I'm looking forward to the period of question and answer. Thank you.